This program is brought to you by the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. I'm Liz Stahl, Extension Educator in Crops. I work out of the Worthington Regional Extension Office, and today we have Dr. Axel Garcia y Garcia. He's a Sustainable Cropping Systems Specialist located at the Southwest Research and Outreach Center in Lamberton. Seth Naeve would have joined us today too, but he is across the world in another totally different time zone. So Axel has graciously agreed to cover the project because he's very actively involved with all the inner workings of that today too. So we'll talk about the project they're working with and then hopefully address some of the questions that came in too through registration earlier when everybody was registering for this program. So with that, I will turn it over to our speaker today, Dr. Axel Garcia Garcia.
Thank you very much, Liz. Basically, I'm going to be talking about one of three components of a multi-state project that is led by my colleague Seth Naeve, who is actually right now overseas doing some work-related stuff. I'm going to be talking about the modeling cereal rye cover crop and soybean yields. And this is the following. This is an effort that comes from 12 states over the continental US, all the way from Minnesota down to Louisiana. So it's a very exciting project. I am in charge of helping Seth with the modeling component, and I will try to explain to you what is this project about and what we have done so far. The project, the modeling component is just one slide for you, so everybody is in the same page. How does model work and why we decided to use these models as well? Where are we with the project right now? And some results about this phase one of the whole project. So the project is basically about modeling cover crop and soybean across producing states, and then on-farm validation of these simulations for field trials that are were conducted in 2024 and will be conducted again this year. Just for you guys to know, these trials are conducted at 2 sites in each of the 12 states that are involved. Why we want to do that? Well, basically because we all know that the adoption of cover crops is still low, mainly around this region of the country. So we want to reduce the barriers and risks, and we would like to help adoption to be more broad. And this is a concern from the soybean producers all around the country. So these are the states that are involved in this project, as I said, all the way from Minnesota down to Louisiana. So in each one of these states, there is a colleague of mine that is a soybean specialist, actually, colleague of Seth, involved with the trials to ground truth our results. So quickly, how this modeling component is being used. So first, our goal is to model the risks and benefits of incorporating cover crops into soybean production practices. And the thing is, we know that cover crops are important in cropping systems, but we want to make sure that we will not affect the yield of our commodity. In this case is soybeans. So as long as our soybean yields are optimized and at the same time the biomass yield of the cover crops are optimized, we should be good. So that's what we are trying to do. And basically, this is how we did it. So in each one of the 24 locations, we simulated cover crop growth in biomass and as well as the grain yield of soybeans for a period of 34 years, 4 years, okay? Specifically for soybeans, in each one of these 24 locations, we simulated 4 seeding dates in each location, and each seeding date also had 4 termination dates. Okay, and then the soybean growth was simulated for each one of those termination dates. So as you can imagine, we have a humongous amount of data, and that we then using some statistical procedures, we summarized, and we will show you where we are at this point. So what we did was we determined the optimal cover crop sowing date to maximize that biomass, the biomass of the cover crops, which is a termination date. And also we estimated the attainable soybean grain yield as a function of the cover crop water use and other factors. Then the idea was to develop a yield penalty to quantify the risk and the magnitude of that risk for potential penalties associated with the use of cover crops during the soybean year. And that information will be shared with growers to enhance, hopefully, their understanding and adoption of cover crops. This component here is going to be the last part of all this effort. We will get there when we validate our simulation outputs with the trials that were conducted in 24 and are being conducted this year. So that means that when we determine the optimal cover crops sowing date to maximize biomass and the attainable soybean yield, we will get that information here again. And this is basically what we already talked about. So in a shell, we simulate, we calibrate, we validate, and then release the information to the growers. So this is a basically 2 years project to do this. So how the models work? Basically, models, as you know, are mimicking the real world. So what we do is we collect soil information, we collect weather data, we also collect plant information, and we combine all that information for the model to work and provide simulations. And the results of those simulations are biomass, growth stages, and then the yield. And then all that information can be used to assess environmental, economic, and resources use components. So basically, why we do calibrate. So let's say the observed data from the field are these red dots. So, and in the simulated, before the calibration is this black line here. So it means we are a little bit off. So then we calibrate and we moved, with statistical procedures, the capacity of the models to calibrate a little bit better or closer to the real world. And then we are ready to use those models. So it's a procedure that is pretty much standard for whoever is using models. So in the whole 12 states and 24 locations, we collected, as I said previously, daily weather data for 34 years. That went from 1990 to 2023. And as you can see here, obviously, this is not detailed, but as you can see here, all this information was set in a way that can be used by in the modeling component. So we have that. The data was collected using the NASA capabilities. So let's say in terms of quality, this data is really very good and is standard all across all the locations that we simulated. And similarly, other model inputs were soil characteristics. So for each one of the 12 states and in the 24 locations, each one of my colleagues in these states provided us with the type of soils that are being used for the field trials. For example, for Minnesota, we have Webster and LeSueur. And let's say for Louisiana, we have Commerce and Texas and so on. So with that information, so we created specific files that were used for the in the cover crop in the crop models. So each one of these soil profiles had to be characterized in terms of depths. So let's say, for example, for Webster in Minnesota, we have different soil profiles, and for each one of these profiles, we have information and so on. So it's a lot of information. So after that, we process the information. We did a pre-calibration of the models and we processed the information. So in terms of weather, as you saw it previously, we have pretty much in all 12 states quite different patterns for not only rainfall, but also for temperatures, as you may imagine. So, and then we see the average for cover crop simulations is what you see here. For example, this very high one is for Louisiana. Basically in Louisiana, this is cereal rye. Basically in Louisiana, you can plant cereal rye, during the whole winter, which will be fine. So the problem, this is interesting because the problems are different depending on where this happens. In Louisiana, one of the most important problems is termination. If we don't terminate on time, so these cover crops grow too much, and farmers might have problems with just excess biomass. So you can see here, I don't know if you can see it, but on average in Louisiana, you can produce more than 8,000 pounds per acre, which is around more than 8,000 also kilograms per hectare. So it's a lot of biomass and can be as much as more than 9,000, okay? So, and for conditions in, let's say in Minnesota, so in Minnesota, on average, we were producing around 1,500 to 2,000 pounds per acre, but we were also able to simulate or to see that we can produce as much as 3,500 pounds per acre, which is correct based on what we have seen in 10 years of research using cover crops in the state. So this is average biomasses across states during at termination time, okay? And this is averaged over termination times, and we considered the highest yields for each one of the 34 years in each one of the two locations. This is the let's say average across locations and across years and locations for each state. Similarly, this figure here are the simulations of soybean yields. Again, there is a lot of variability depending on the year. Obviously, you can see that in the latest years, with some exceptions, we had some low yields of soybeans, which is what we saw during the time we had issues with drought. But in general, let's say the model was able to properly simulate, the yields in each one of these states. This, and I want to be clear, these results are pre-calibrated. Why this? Because basically the 2024 field trials for soybeans and cover crops came a little bit late, but which is what we expected because, the season has to finish and then collect the information and those things. And now we already have the data, but we didn't have time to put this data here to show you where we stand with what we saw at field in 2024. But still, this information is correct. We checked with the information from the USDA and other sources like extension publication from each one of the 12 states involved. So when we have all this information, we move to the next step, which was basically trying to determine when will be the best cover crop planting, the best cover crop termination, and then we have the green line is the cover crop, let's say, window for the growing season for cover crop, and the blue triangle is the best soybean planting for each state. So obviously, again, Louisiana is quite different to the others because it's far south and it's quite warm over there. So you can see that basically we can have, soybeans planted as early as the 1st of May, and which coincides with the termination of cover crops and goes all the ways to basically into the end of October sometimes for cover crops growth. So we can also see that for Minnesota here, the cover crop planting is around mid of September, the best cover crop planting, okay? And termination, which is the orange dot, is very close to when is the best planting for soybeans. So what does it mean? It means that basically, which is what pretty much everybody knows, it means that our our termination window for cover crop in Minnesota is very close to the best planting time for soybeans. So, what can be done in order to optimize biomass yield of the cover crops without affecting soybean yields? So we will talk about that in a minute. And we can try to interpret that basically from each one of the other states. Well, for most states, the best, let me put it here, for most states, the best planting for cover crops is around mid to end September, okay? And also the best termination is around the first week of May, with some exceptions like in Kentucky and Louisiana, and also, what is the other one? Kentucky, Louisiana, and Illinois, okay? So that's what we did. So with the information we have in terms of weather, the soil, and the management, which is planting dates, termination dates, those kind of things, we were able to simulate cover crops biomass at termination and grain yield of soybeans. So with all that information, we optimize results to try to determine the best cover crop planting, the best cover crop termination, and the best soybean planting date as well. With all that information, then the next step was to determine how much effect is soil water, not only on soybeans, but also on the cover crop. So the first graph you see here in the upper left corner of your screen, is the average cover crop biomass. Okay, so you can see that in some states there is a pretty good relation between the proportion of evapotranspiration. That means as related to rainfall. That means when the evapotranspiration is higher than the rainfall. So that means we had some generally speaking, lack of water. So there is a pretty good relation in some states, and there is almost no relation with other states, including Minnesota. So as you can see here, all is zero means there is not much relationship with that. But we have in Iowa, we have in North Carolina, and Minnesota has, I'm sorry, it's in Michigan when there is no relationship. North Carolina, Minnesota, Iowa, and others have a little bit of a relationship with that. But the most important one, which is soybeans, you can see that the trend is a little bit more important than for soybeans. How we did interpret this? So what we did is that if the ET again was higher than the rainfall, which is this is the proportion you see here, where 0 is there is no issue, and 1 is, a lot of issues with that. So we can see that, the relationship is much higher, and we assume that this ET was higher than the rainfall because due to the use of cover crops. So with these two um, results, what we did was then to try to determine how much penalty yield of soybean will have. Well, if it goes up and close to 0, if it goes up, it means that there is no penalty, but it's a gain, okay? But if it goes down, obviously it means that there is a penalty on yield. So for example, for Iowa here, in some few instances, which is why this goes all the way down to 15%, we can have a yield penalty as much as 15%. If we plant soybeans during a period that is not the optimum, okay? So in places like in Illinois, we start with some penalty, but then, as we as the planting is delayed in days, this penalty is reduced and it becomes a gain. And basically, the gain means from having a more or less 5% penalty to having no penalty at all. For Minnesota, so the penalty on using cover crops on soybeans is very little. I don't know if you guys can see it, but we start a little bit negative here, but quickly it goes close to 0. But the thing that struck us the most here is that it stays close to 0. It goes a little bit up because of the size of the, of the scale here. We don't see it, but it goes a little bit up if you delay the planting for 10 days. So this is, you plant the soybeans when you terminate cover crops here at 0, or you plant soybeans after 5 days termination, or you plant soybeans after 10 days termination. Okay, you can see that in Minnesota, there is not too much effect. It's positive, that means there is a gain, but it's very little still. In states like North Carolina, it's similar to Iowa and also to Pennsylvania. We see that even if we delay it, it goes down. So in that, there are several reasons for that. We don't want to speculate at this point because we're still having one more year when we are going to further calibrate the models and validate the results. But basically, this is related to moving from the optimum planting date and those kind of things, okay? So this is basically what this project is about and what we have done so far. So I want to wrap up with the next steps, which is, as I said previously, validate results with 2024 and 2025 field trials, which we expect to refine the results from this modeling output. And I show you this graph previously. What we want to do is move this black curve here from where it is right now to closer to what we observe at that field, which after calibration and validation, our simulations will look pretty much similar to what we see here in this green curve. And this is what we are going to do. At the end of this project, so we plan to have, a communication program that will establish a national social media presence, create a national video series about this, and develop a collaborative webinar, leveraging other checkups supported efforts. So that is going to happen most likely at the end of 2025 or in 2026. So with that, I would like to finish by giving a big thank you to our sponsors. And also this project wouldn't have been possible without the support of all soybean specialists across each in each one of these 12 states where we are conducting this this work. With that, I am done, and I open for questions if that you might have. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Axel. A lot of interesting work. So just kind of to clarify again, so you're developing these models off of weather data and all that, correct? And then now you did some validation trials in across the states. We've got a question like wondering where the validation trials were done in Minnesota.
Yeah, can I stop sharing first? I'm sorry.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Oh, that's a nice picture.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we have trials for Minnesota. We have trials in LeSueur and in Lamberton at the Southwest Research and Outreach Center. So those are the two locations we are using as for calibration and validation of the model outputs.
Okay, okay.
Mhm.
No, that's good. And then so another question relates to this too. And maybe you said this and I didn't catch it, but are you using different rye varieties across the sites? Like what impact do you think the cereal rye variety has,
Mm.
across locations? I'm assuming you're using different ones or maybe you're not, but
That's a very good question. No, we are using exactly the same variety. That
oh,
the
okay.
difference is that the cereal rye cover crop is being planted at four different dates in each one of the 24 locations, in each one of the two locations per state. And each one of those sowing or termination day or planting dates have four termination dates. Each sowing date has four termination dates. So that means we terminated the cereal rye 16 times basically in each one of the
Mm,
locations. Yeah.
okay.
So that allow us to capture the variability and eventually, let's say the potential variability that might exist due to different varieties, soils, weather conditions, and management as well. But it's
Okay.
not perfect, I have to say it, but it really comes very close to what we have seen it so far at field.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're getting some more questions about this. Again, I'm not sure how much work has been done and how much you know about different, yeah, is there a difference between indeterminate and determinate? Oh, so this is about soybean varieties. Again, with the cereal rye varieties, I'm not sure how much is actually known about different varieties, but here's a question relates to the soybeans then, being indeterminate versus determinate soybean varieties, because, Louisiana would have the indeterminate, I suppose, or the term determinate, and
Determined.
we'd have
Yeah.
the indeterminate up north. Is that playing a role, do you think, of anything or?
Yeah, and that is considered in the models. Okay, so for each state, we made sure that we will use a maturity group that corresponds to where that location is. And obviously, when we calibrate the models, we make sure that they pretty much mimic what a determinate or indeterminate would be. Yeah, that was considered in the model. I just
Okay.
didn't talk about because it's too many details.
Yeah, right, right. And another one just related again to the trials. Are they set up, are the soybeans following corn, or do you have different rotations in the setups?
Wow, good questions. Yeah, all for all 12 states and 24 locations, we assume that it's corn that comes after.
Okay.
Yes, it's a corn soybean rotation for all 12. And we have to make that in order for the results to be comparable. So we have pretty much everything set exactly the same for each location, each state.
Okay.
Mhm.
And then another one, just kind of clarifying again, based on the validations, the best termination timing in relation to soybean planting, if you want to just kind of clarify that again, was that, yeah, if you could kind of restate that, that's one of the questions we have here.
Well, yes. I don't know what exactly the question is, but yeah.
Like the best termination timing based of the cover
Mhm.
crop based on soybean planting.
Right. Obviously, the best termination timing varies across locations, across states and locations, right? Mostly across stations. It's very contrasting. For example, if you look the termination timing, for example, in Minnesota as compared to all the way down to Louisiana. Yeah, so this and that is all obviously due to several factors, but the most important ones are weather and soil. To give you an example, in Lamberton we receive about the equivalent to 700 millimeters of rainfall during the year. Let's 750 actually, while in all the way down in Louisiana we receive almost 2,000. So it's a huge difference, right? So
Hmm.
termination, how did we come up with the best termination timing? So what we did was the outputs from, let's say, 4 termination timings during 34 years were analyzed to extract the best termination timing for the cover crop in terms of maximum biomass. So we figured out that just using one, it will be like just the highest that was obtained, which is not how things work in the real world. So what we did then was we extracted the 3 most highest yields for each location in each state, and then we use uh, an empirical model that will optimize the yield, the biomass yield, and the planting date. Overall, let's say for conditions in Minnesota, doing this approach, we find out that the best planting date is around the 19th of September, uh, which so I was amazed because I've seen from my research, my field trials over these last years, that when we plant around mid-September to the 20th of September, uh, cedar rye does just well. There are reasons for that. Some a little bit of rainfall, and so do you assume that
Hmm.
you drill when you seed it and those kind of things? So there is a good seed soil contact and those kind of things. So it did well. The model, all these basic agronomics, the model shows that it can really simulate it quite well. And that was for each one of the 12 states and 24 locations.
Okay. And then again, the termination would probably be around planting to, was it like 5 to 10
Okay,
days after planting of soybeans? Was
the,
that kind of your optimal
yeah,
window
for
or?
determination exactly, unfortunately, the determination of cover crops for best or highest biomass, it will affect the best planting for soybeans. So how does go? I mean, in terms of, the penalty, well, it depends on the state again. But basically, in some locations, we can have the luxury of having the best termination of the cover crops, uh, good enough to then plant the soybeans without having penalties at all. But in most, we will have a little bit of penalty. So the bottom line here is that eventually we might need to have a trade-off. Uh, have Make sure that the cover crops produce as much as possible, and make sure that the soybeans in this case, at the minimum, they will not reduce their yield potential. So that's how it goes.
Yep, all the trade-offs.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. Other questions. We got several on here. Um, just curious about some questions relating to how is the planning of the cover crop being done? Is it like broadcast spread or is it drilled, interseeded? Just kind of wondering what the how the cover
Y-
crops are being
Yeah,
seeded.
good question. Yeah. So we are doing what our field trials are about. So we are drilling the cover crop. So it's not broadcasted. It's all drilled in all
Getting
12 states again. Yeah.
okay. So
Yeah.
I'm assuming because that's what we've seen too, is that's kind of the best chance you're going to get good
That's correct.
establishment is getting the good seed to soil contact. Not
Yeah,
saying
that
the other methods don't work, but then you're hoping for a timely rain and all that too, right?
yeah, you have to
Yeah,
adjust some
yeah.
stuff so in order to catch up with that. Yeah.
And then termination, are they the same practices, do you know, or what do you know what methods people are using for the termination of the cover crop?
As far as I know, most people is just burning down the cover crop. So, Organic producers do a little bit different. Organic producers, they can terminate mechanically, but that's a different story. It's a little bit more complicated. But for our conditions, for what we did, we are assuming that cover crop is burned down with a herbicide. So the,
Okay.
the model terminates the cover crops when we said it's time to terminate it, and so it does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And in Minnesota, don't just throw in, we've done like Dr. Devlin Sarangi and his crew, they have done trials and looking at mechanical methods and herbicide methods. And yeah, the treatments with glyphosate have been the most effective, most consistent control for terminating a cover crop early in the spring. Let's see, other ones here. Wondering if the trials will end in 2025, or do you know if they'll continue into the future?
Oh, well, I guess
Somebody
I
want to
will.
fund it, right?
Yeah, well, we have funding for 2025, but I
Okay.
guess Seth will be the one that better answer this question. And the reason is because Seth is the principal investigator in this multi-state project. Yeah,
Okay. No,
but hopefully we
that's
will have
fair.
a 2026. That will be great. And actually, what I would like to see from the modeling perspective is not only to have a 2026 field trial, but also that those trials be conducted at different locations, not the same
Mhm.
locations as in 2024 and 2025.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, wondering here too, is weed control or lack thereof by termination date factored into resulting yield? So is weed control a factor into this, or do you know if all these um, studies,
No,
I would assume that, yeah, are they
well,
controlling weeds or?
from the field trials is a different story, but basically in the modeling we don't model weed growth and those kind of things because it's extremely complex, and I will be lying if I
Mhm.
tell you that we did that. So we have to make some trade-offs as well,
Mhm.
some assumptions, and the assumption here is that the fields are clean, are free of
Mhm.
weeds, which is, in the real world what farmers try to do. They try to keep their fields as clean as possible out of
Yeah.
weeds. That's what we did.
Yep. Then we have another question here. It's just trying to wrap their head around the yield penalties, that there's yield penalties in Iowa, but not as much in Illinois. Just kind of wondering what might be playing a role in that. Are there any integrated pest management issues at any of the sites too? Um, if we're having any green bridge issues, for example, do you know? Or um,
Well, a short question is I don't, but I can speculate a little bit, okay?
mhm,
Um, well, first, we do not simulate pests and those kind of things. That's another very, very hot topic in the crop modeling world that basically nobody does around the world. There are some efforts, but they are highly variable and too much errors because pests are highly dynamic. So it's really a headache to work on that. Well, that said,
mhm.
so I would say that one of the issues I've seen working with this data is weather. So, for example, we all know that Minnesota has a very short uh, planting window and has a very short seeding window for the cover crops, termination window for the cover crops. That's for Minnesota, but it applies at certain point for some parts of Iowa as well. And that might be one of the reasons why in Iowa we see a sharper decline, decline in terms of soybean yield. But the third thing I wanted to address is that that decline sometimes is driven by one specific point. And that could have happened because, weather conditions were quite different that specific year. And that was the case in some states. I don't remember if that was the case for Iowa, but it could have been easily. So there are several
So,
things that we have to still dig on it. Yeah.
So one question I have with this model too, so once you have this model developed, will somebody be able to like plug in, okay, it's drier or, you know, my conditions are more wet or whatever. Wasn't able to plant my cover crop till later. are you going to be able to plug in data like that too to kind of fine tune when you should plant a cover crop or terminate it the following spring, or am I getting too far off?
That's that's a very hard question.
Oh, sorry.
Uh, no, no, that's okay. No, I can address it, but there is a very good reason why that is not an easy thing to resolve. And the reason is soil moisture monitoring. Okay, so
Mhm.
two things here. One is that we are not monitoring soil moisture, and so we cannot say that with certainty. But the other is that these models also simulate soil water conditions. So we are already working on the analysis of those outputs. So in general, we are going to be able to say more or less exactly what you are saying, because these conditions, this happened. So, but those conditions are quite, let's say, general. They are not specific because we don't have that information. And the reason why we did not monitor soil moisture is because it becomes extremely expensive. Okay. Um, and I don't have the numbers, but basically this project is in 12 states, 2 locations per state. It's quite cheap if you wish in terms of what's how much it costs to do this. Uh, but if we wanted to do with soil moisture, that would we will need to buy,
Yeah, right.
equipment devices to put in each one of those locations to have the people to monitor it. And if we don't have the people, it has to be
Mhm.
automated, which means much more expensive and so on.
Yeah,
But
no, I think
yes,
this is really exciting work too. And just think like last year, how things would have turned out. We were like, oh, we got a drought, and then we had it inundated with water. So
well, the
it's all over the
models
board, right?
the models tell you, okay, for example, the model can tell you, okay, this year in this location, let's say, for example, soybeans didn't do well because it was dry during this period of the time, or the cover crop died because of this. The models tell us that. So we are extracting that info as well. We have a little bit of that information.
We had one more question coming here too. If the assumption is that you're seeding the cover crop after corn in the fall, wouldn't the corn have to be harvested significantly early? Yep. Are we calculating yield loss on the corn for early varieties, or is that significant with drying? And that's why, a lot of our
Mhm.
work is with after corn silage, correct? I mean,
Really,
yeah.
really very good questions. Okay, so this is what we did. We because we how to put this? It is impossible just to simulate for one seeding date for the cover crop. So we seed it at different times. We seed it 4 times. Okay, and those 4 seeding times vary across states. Okay, it's not the
Mhm.
same. Let's say Minnesota than in Louisiana, obviously, or even Minnesota and as close as Iowa or Wisconsin. There are slight differences there. So with that, so we try to come up with, the issues that we might have because corn was harvested, let's say the 30th of September or the 20th of September, which is quite rare, and so on. So we have different planting seeding times.
Mhm.
That's the way we resolved it.
Yeah. Yep.
Mhm.
Nope. And you're showing what it shows. So, oh,
Yeah.
that's very exciting. And I'm going to look at some of the questions that we had gotten in earlier that do relate to this too. Because we're basically talking about potentially planting green with cover crops too. Just curious, do you have any, what would be some of your best practices that you would suggest, if you're planting green, with soybeans. And you could speculate on corn too if you want. I know we're focusing on soybeans today, but that's one of the questions we've had people bring in as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we've done some work with planting green. Actually, I like it. I like it a lot. Briefly, planting green works pretty well for soybeans, not as well for corn, but it is possible to do it with corn as well. So the planting green thing is, why do I like planting green? Because it allows me to keep the cover crop at field for a longer period of time, okay? And then we will come and we will plant corn or soybeans into standing cover crop. It is a little bit tricky to do it, but as I said, for soybeans works pretty well. Uh, so when, let's say, the trials we have conducted, usually I try to keep my cover crop all the way to mid-May at least. And then let's say, just to put an example, uh, I will come and plant soybeans on the 15th of May into standing cover crop. So then we can terminate the cover crop immediately after we plant soybeans, or we can delay the termination for 5, 10, up to maybe 12, 14 days. And it will be fine. The soybean will be fine. Now for corn, so we will plant green, and most likely we have to terminate it immediately, and probably not later than 2, 3 days, which I did it and it worked. So we have yet to publish that information actually. But for soybeans, we can delay the termination by just burning down the cover crop with a herbicide. We gotta make sure that the herbicide does not grow too much. We have to avoid the cover crop going into flag leaf or something like that, because it becomes quite difficult to terminate it. But if we do it before, we'll be fine. The other thing is that if we terminate cover crops at the beginning of May, which is basically what we do, in a regular basis, in Minnesota, we are getting like maybe 1,500 pounds per acre of biomass, dry biomass. If we use planting green, we will double that amount. We will easily go to 3,000 to 3,500 pounds per acre. And that is a good amount of biomass to suppress weeds growth. So it works. Better for soybeans, not as good for corn, but if we terminate immediately after we plant corn, it should work as well.
Yeah, and like, like you're alluding to, yeah, it's a lower risk in soybeans. I mean, sometimes we have seen an issue, like in on-farm trials too, especially if it was like really dry, if we terminated the cover crop after planting in soybeans, but it's a lot lower risk than with corn, of having a yield impact and the whole green bridge issues, which, we always, not that we see that all the time, but there's the potential for that too.
Yeah, and there is
Um,
one thing, one important thing I forgot to mention here, because I have the questions in front of me in my other screen, and is the allelopathy thing. So allelopathic issues exist, obviously, and we know that cereal rye has some of that, some allelopathic issue. This is the thing for corn and soybeans. This is kind of a misconception, because I haven't done myself, but I have read, you know, research done by others that basically it does not affect corn and soybean establishment. And the reason for that is because both corn and soybean have large seeds, and allelopathy is not an issue with large seeds, because mostly for soybean has enough nutrients in the seed, to withstand those kind of things. Okay, uh, so in brief, we shouldn't be concerned with the allelopathic issues. Having corn or soybeans following cereal rye, it's not a problem. The problem for corn mostly is that if we have too much cereal rye biomass, nitrogen might be tied up, okay? And
mhm.
this is because we terminated too late, so this carbon-nitrogen ratio might be too high. But for conditions in Minnesota, back to Minnesota, the carbon-nitrogen ratio of cereal rye biomass at termination is pretty low. It's 20 or less. Practically means that it's a good ratio enough for that biomass to decompose as soon as possible, and we will not affect
Mhm.
available nitrogen in the soil. So we should be good with that.
Yeah, no, we did have another question about the trials here too. Did all the sites implement the same soybean planting practices, like same population, same row width? Um, I imagine they might have different populations across the states because I know even within the state of Minnesota we have different populations, but maybe not with this
Mm,
trial. Um,
Well, I based the simulations on the inputs I got from my colleagues around the states, the states involved. There were a couple of states where, even planting row distance was a little bit different. I don't remember which ones were, but there were just two. And then
mm,
also Nebraska is irrigated.
mhm.
Okay, so we use irrigation in the models. What was the other part of the question?
Oh, oops, I just got rid of it. Row width and
Yeah, row with a couple of states are different, and
oh shoot. Yeah,
well, that's
I
fine.
just moved that.
So
I think you
basically,
caught it.
yeah, I guess I got
Sorry
it.
if I did not. That's it.
But basically, we try to make sure that we will get as close as possible to what happens in
Yeah.
most
Yep.
states. Yes.
Nope, that makes sense. And again, you mentioned um again, I'll look back some of the questions that we got in earlier too. You just talked a little bit about nitrogen cycling too, and I know you've done a lot of work with nitrogen too. Do you have any comments you'd want to say about like nitrogen recommendations, how cover crops might affect that, and how much, they could take up potentially, like cereal rye? Any comments about that?
Yeah, I can comment a little bit on that based on what I've done and seen with cereal rice specifically. Well, first, we don't have yet enough information to provide farmers with, nitrogen credit from cover crops, which I am a little bit ashamed of that. But the reason is because uh, it's really complex. It is really complex. And my colleagues who work specifically with nitrogen, for example, they are doing something like that, but I believe they are not ready yet to release their results, but they are going in the right way. So that said, we conducted already a couple of experiments where we tried to follow, the decomposition ratio of the cover crop residue in the soil as related to available nitrogen released and get back to the system. So we did that some years ago, and we noticed that, you know, for a 2,000, 3,000 pounds per acre cereal rye, that amount of biomass will provide to the system between 25 to more or less 50 plus pounds of total nitrogen into the system. Okay, from those, let's say 50 pounds of total nitrogen, the decomposition shows that more or less 40%, I would say maybe 20, 25 pounds will become available nitrogen. And this becomes available nitrogen more or less after, I don't remember the time, but let me see, I guess was somewhere in July. It takes a little bit of time, for this decomposition to happen. But we publish that information. If someone is interested, I can pass them that info as well. Uh,
Yeah. Yep.
but we haven't gone to the next step, which is, okay, since if we are using cover crops, this type of cover crop, and we are gonna get this amount, so you should change your fertilization strategy to this. We haven't gotten there yet, but we already
Yep.
have some
That's
info, but it's still not enough.
Yep, something we're still trying to work on, but I'm looking at the time here, and I did want to put on a plug. A lot of the questions we had earlier too relate to some cover crop recipes that we have put out. They're say recipes, but they're through the Midwest Cover Crop Council. Axel and myself, Anna Cates, and others have been involved in putting these together. But if you want to make sure those end up in the chat, yep. So those are some really great resources. Anybody wanting to, start out with cover crops, what are some of the easy entry points? Just some suggested practice. I do really encourage people to check that out. Also, the Midwest Cover Crop Council, they have an excellent selector tool we're working on, that gets revised every so many years, and we're working through that again here. But again, a lot of great information on there. And of course, our Extension Crops website. But I'm gonna thank everybody too. I know we still have lots of questions. We do have our cover crop field day coming up, right? Axel, if anybody wants to go to that, that'll be in June. I forget what the actual date is. I should know that off the top of my head, but we will send that out to everybody too. That'll be on our Minnesota Extension Crops website as well. But again, I want to thank everybody for joining today. And again, thanks to our sponsors, the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. And of course, thank you, Axel, for doing the heavy lifting today. And next week's session, that will be on keeping track of changes in corn insect challenges with Dr. Fei Yang. He is our U of M Extension corn entomologist. So thanks everybody for joining today, and hopefully we shall see you next week.
Thank you for having me.